All right. Hi, everybody. Again, we're going to wait one more minute as people move into the room. So thank you for standing by. We really appreciate it. And then I will introduce our speakers. While we are waiting, I want to just remind everybody to put their questions in the Q&A. If I have more than 5 questions, we'll get started earlier with your questions because we really like to focus on the audience. Okay. So, hi, everybody. I am Susan Aaronson, the director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub here at GWU. Except that actually this is an office in my house. And welcome to the Hub Mindaru Cinco de Mayo webinar on Generative AI 101. We're really grateful that you're taking the time to learn with us. So please excuse my moment of PR, but I'm going to use this opportunity to introduce the NSF, Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society, where Hal Daumé is the PI, and David Broniatowski is a co-PI, and I am also a co-PI. And we'll be working on ways to find AI more accountable by making it more inclusive, and hopefully in so doing, build trust in AI. Okay, so we're going to begin our formal webinar. Generative AI is simultaneously wonderful, horrible, scary, useful, opaque, exciting, and dangerous. So it will be helpful to understand how generative AI is different from other forms of AI and whether or not it needs a different approach to governance. Our speakers today will answer those questions, and then we will open it up to your questions so you can see the Q&A. Please put your questions there, and I will make sure that our thoughtful speakers answer them. Today's speakers bring very different perspectives to these questions. So I'm going to begin. Today's speaker is Sarah Myers-West, who is the managing director of the AI Now Institute and co-author of Confronting Tech Power and a Ph.D. from the Annenberg School at the University, USC. And another speaker is David Broniatowski, who is an associate professor in engineering management and systems engineering. He's also director of the decision-making and systems architecture laboratory at GWU. And Hal Daumé III, who is the Volpi-Cupal, I hope I pronounced that right, family endowed professor in computer science at the University of Maryland. So thank you so much for joining us today, speakers. So Hal, I'm going to begin with you. You're a computer scientist. What's new about generative AI?
You'd think I would know how to unmute myself at this point. Hi, everyone. So thanks for having me. Also, I also am a USC grad. I got my PhD in computer science from USC. Okay, so first, like, what do I think of when I think of generative AI? I mean, I think of, systems that are, sort of producing like large outputs, like whether it's text or speech or audio or something like that. That's like fundamentally different from, I think, the sorts of things that people are maybe more used to dealing with, which is, suggesting the next song to listen to on Spotify or suggesting directions on Google Maps or something like that. And so, I don't think there's like a hard and fast line, but, I think there's sort of extremes where on the one side, you have systems that are sort of making individual decisions, or maybe like little small collections of decisions, like top 5 songs to recommend. And then on the other end, you have these things that are, generating video complete with audio full from scratch. So that's what I think of when I think of generative AI. I'm thinking of this side. And so from a technology perspective, to some degree, you can sort of say, well, the generative AI is just a big scaling up of the individual things. You're still predicting at the end of the day, like individual pixels, if you're generating an image, or individual words if you're generating a story. But there's a lot more that goes into it, right? You can't, predict those pixels independently. They have to go together and form, some sort of like coherent and hopefully, useful image for people. I think one of the other big changes has to do with how people interpret the outputs of these systems. So I think when a person is shown, Spotify recommendations, it's sort of something that people are used to computers doing. But when people are shown, a full image or a video or something like that generated by a computer, they're maybe not so used to that happening. And in particular, things that are sort of in the generative space are things that I think people are used to thinking of as like unique properties of humanhood. We're not used to talking to animals, except maybe parrots. We're not used to art produced by animals. I think crows have drawn some art, but it's very different. And so I think there's also a lot of like projection of ourselves onto what happens. Just like a little anecdote, like I have a 2.5-year-old, and like a year ago he'd come up to me and he'd say, like my toy broke, right? And like my brain is immediately like, oh, he's upset, he wants it fixed, he wants blah blah blah. But like at the end of the day, no, he was just saying his toy broke. The rest is like my brain making sense of what he's saying in a larger context. And I think a lot of what's happening with generative AI is, at the end of the day, it is just like individual predictions of words or pixels or something like that. But we as people interpret it differently because it seems more human-like.
Thank you for that. David, do you want to add anything here?
Sure. So I actually want to build on the point that Hal just mentioned, which is the role of humans in terms of interpreting generative AI. And I think that's a really, really important angle to take on this, because one of the key distinctions I think about current generative AI algorithms is the ways in which they build coherent representations. And at the end of the day, coherence is a mental representation. It's something that exists sort of inside our heads. And I think that the use of the term artificial intelligence already makes a suggestion that leads us to believe that in some way these algorithms are intelligent, and leads us to anthropomorphize them as if they did have some kind of intelligence. And although the jury is still out on that, my personal feeling is that we are not yet at an actual artificial intelligence. And so what does that lead us to as far as how we interpret these algorithms, and what are their potentials, and also what are their harms? I think that a lot of harm may result from the fact that we are projecting intelligence onto these algorithms, whereas in fact they generate cohesive representations, but cohesive is not necessarily the same as the coherent representations themselves. On the other hand, I think a lot of the benefits come about because the cohesiveness of the output allows us as human beings to engage our creativity in a way that would have been a lot harder only a few years ago. So I think that I see these algorithms in a sense as infrastructure as opposed to as artificial intelligence. What I mean by that is we have a lot of people generating data, and those people are generating data that these algorithms are then serving as a bridge to other people who are consuming the products of the algorithms. And so I see the algorithms as a tool for social connection that can be used for good things, but could also be used for bad things, depending on whether we perceive it as a tool or we perceive it as an independent actor in and of itself. If we perceive it as an independent actor, I think what that does is that obfuscates the people on the other end who are using the tool. And we don't want to be in a Wizard of Oz type of situation, ignore the man behind the curtain.
Sarah, can you add to that? Would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I'll be brief, but I think, to both of Hal and David's points, one of the things that I think is unique about this moment from a policy standpoint is the fact of, the shift that comes when people on a broad scale are able to directly interact with artificial intelligence technologies. The way that many of us are realistically interacting with AI is when it's used to make decisions that affect us, but we're rarely aware of that taking place. It's involved in decisions about our credit, whether we're going to get access to a mortgage or whether we get called in for a job interview. So we interface with AI constantly, but in ways that are less tangible than generative AI, than ChatGPT. And so now people, I think, are having a much more visceral engagement with artificial intelligence. And that's, I think, led to a wave of excitement and also anxiety about what the deployment of these systems will do, and honestly has been doing for some time. And I think that that's created a policy window for swifter action on an AI agenda, and I think also renewed interest in enforcement of our existing laws.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Hey, audience, we really want to hear from you. So please enter your questions in the Q&A and we can make sure to answer them. Okay, so this is, I think, quite interesting. We've talked about this notion as a form of infrastructure, this notion appearing to mimic human intelligence. We've talked a little bit about the governance. Could you, David, chat a bit with us about the potential for generative, like where do you see this helping society? And what specific benefits do you see arising out of it?
Absolutely. So I see generative AI as really something that can augment human capabilities, at least has the potential to do so when used appropriately. And I think that one of the key things that we see about tools such as ChatGPT or Midjourney is that if you are clever in your prompt engineering, you can get really useful and interesting results. On the other hand, if you are using these tools in a way that that basically takes the output as given, right? Then that's where you run into the possibility of harms. So I think, like many tools, we're still learning how to use them, and we're still learning to figure out what are the ways that they can be used appropriately and what are the ways that they cannot be. And so if we're looking for the ability to try to understand the potential for tools like ChatGPT, it can help us by, for example, drawing on existing structures and existing formulations of text that are out there. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I want to write a form email, and I know it's going to be a form email. Well, ChatGPT is really good at getting me a form email that I can then take the form and insert my own content. If, on the other hand, I go too far and I say, well, not only do I want it to write a form email, I want it to write everything, and I want it to be 100% factually accurate, and I want it to basically do the work for me so I don't have to think about it at all, that's when we run into difficulties. Similarly, for visual generative AI, if we want to say, generate a piece of art that is in a particular style, well, then we're running into problems where we're possibly drawing on other people's work. We're possibly having the tool simply generate something that may be a lightly modified version of a memorized piece of artwork that someone else generated, which has the potential to cause harm in the sense of non-attribution. On the other hand, if we use that as a first step towards a creative process and fully recognize what is the role of the algorithm and what is the role of the human, then I think that there is a lot of upside potential. So in the same way that we might say, well, we would never tell a painter not to use this brush versus that brush, or not to use this technique versus that technique. I see generative AI as adding to the quiver, adding to the toolbox of techniques that might be available to content creators, with the caveat that anytime you use a technique, it's important to be able to recognize what are the pros and cons of that technique, what are the limitations of the technique. And at the end of the day, if somebody is not using the technique that's aligned with our best practices, then we have to understand, where does the responsibility lie? And one of the things we may want to think about as a society moving forward is whether the uses of generative AI require some sort of licensing or some sort of deep understanding of the ways in which those techniques might potentially cause harm, such that we're not, in the same way we wouldn't let somebody who doesn't know how to appropriately use a car drive a car. We want to make sure that somebody who doesn't appropriately use a highly powerful generative AI algorithm is unintentionally using it in a way that is known to cause harm.
You just brought up a really interesting concept akin to the use of firearms. Who should be licensed? Who should be liable? But let me, before we get into that, and I urge the audience to keep putting their questions in the Q&A. Hal and Sarah, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. And I realized when I phrased this, I said the benefits, but it's hard not to say it as David did, the costs. So feel free to do that as well. Okay, so Hal, do you want to go? You ready? You look like you really wanted to say something. And before you do, could you please define for everyone what a prompt is?
Oh, sure. So for most of these models, in order to get them to do something, you kind of have to tell them what to do. And so prompt is just sort of essentially an instruction. Plug, not for me, but if you're really interested, check out Learn Prompting. I think it's .org. This was developed by an undergrad here at University of Maryland, actually has an English project and now has almost like 1 million subscribers. So if you want to learn how to use these things well, it's a really amazing resource. Okay, end of plug. So, I think one of the big, if we think about, what happened when web search became a normal thing, right? Like everyone had lots of information at their fingertips. We also had problems of not everything on the internet is accurate. But at the end of the day, I think we've found ways to try to, get the best out of this. And, I think this has really amplified what an individual person can do. I think generative AI is the same, but more. It's like, you could imagine, I think fairly easily, a world in which, almost anything you want to do, you can have like a little personalized expert that will help you learn to do it, that will help you do it. And, I think this is something that, really does have the potential to fundamentally change what individual people are able to do. I don't want to discount the harms. I think everything David said is certainly true, but it reminds me a little bit of this story I heard from Ed Chi, who's at Google, about when they started introducing autocomplete on web search, right? So autocomplete on web search is probably actually the form of generative AI that most people have the most familiarity with. We just don't really think of it as generative AI. But one of the big concerns, apparently internally at Google, when that was released, was that it would reduce search complexity, that people would start just searching for the same things over and over again because you're suggesting things to them. And at least anecdotally, and I don't know that there's a paper that shows this, that didn't turn out to be the case. And in fact, search complexity increased on adult of this. And so, I think it's an open question what this looks like in sort of these bigger generative AI spaces. But, I think with my optimist hat on, I think there's at least some suggestion that, the use of these technologies will lead people to do things that, they really would have struggled to do otherwise, in addition to doing boring things like write form emails.
Thank you, Hal. Sarah? Can you talk about the benefits?
Sure. I mean, I think it's helpful to sort of think through the harms associated with this technology holistically. So many of these harms are sort of diffused across different applications, and others are more individual and sector specific. You know, one of I think the first and most prominent concerns is around the potential for sort of generation of disinformation or fraudulent information at scale. And the Federal Trade Commission has made a pretty strong statement that, you know, if you're creating a system that enables fraud at scale, or if you're using it to produce fraud at scale, you know, this would be in violation of the law, and they intend to enforce it. So that's kind of one bucket of concerns. In the news this week has been the WGA strike. And one of the core concerns that's being raised by the writers is that, you know, the studios are likely to use artificial intelligence to sort of cut them out of the writing process, or to devalue their work. So rather than write a script, you know, have AI involved in the process and then pay them a lot less to edit the script than they would to generate the script from the start. So the concerns for labor impacts, I think, are another harm that's come to the forefront. Similarly, there are concerns around the labor that's needed to train these systems. The folks who were involved in labeling and training the data that is used in ChatGPT have themselves unionized because they are underpaid and have poor working conditions. There's a number of cybersecurity concerns. You know, for example, you can produce fraud at scale. You can also produce phishing attacks at scale. There are potential vulnerabilities in this, in these systems, and I think the security risks are you know, should be very prominent on folks' minds. Then I mean, I can keep running down, but I'll just like one last one that I'll maybe call out. I think that there are some real competition concerns to be raised here, in that, you know, one, the dominant models are very reliant on heavy amounts of computational power to process them. You know, there's the amount of, you know, computational power required to train the models, which Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has called eye-watering. The amount of computational power needed to continue to run these models is quite high. So, you know, the companies that have existing cloud infrastructures are, you know, well positioned to kind of reinforce their dominance. And we're seeing new names in this market, you know, new startups. A lot of those have contracts, though, with Amazon and Microsoft and Google. Amazon's, you know, Bedrock is essentially like a marketplace. So it's tied to AWS, and you can buy other firms' generative AI products, but, you know, they're going to run on Amazon Web Services, and Amazon takes a cut. So I think there's concerns around sort of the further cementing of control among a handful of firms that have already become really massive in the tech industry, and what harms ensue with like the amount of economic power that these companies have amassed. There's a whole lot of others. We didn't even get into climate, and I saw someone brought that up in the Q&A, but they're extremely climate intensive. There's a lot of community impacts on water supplies. Like happy to chat more about all of that when we get into open questions.
I'm gonna spring one on you, given what you just said. I'll start with you, Sarah.
Sure.
If I may. You talked about the monopoly power of these firms. They are sourcing data from around the world, as David pointed out. And subject to court cases. Do you worry about a few firms sucking up and controlling the use of that much of the world's data?
I mean, I think that's concerning just on its own outside of the context of generative AI. I think that commercial surveillance has become kind of the business model for the internet, I think is itself concerning. I think another layer to this is often for deploying these systems into a product that will be really useful. You need a very like carefully calibrated and focused data set for particular uses. I think, Google's Bard product that's focused on health data, I think is a good example of this. And there, the fact that these companies have really vast horizontal holdings is pretty important as well, that they have access to data in particular industry verticals gives them a significant advantage over other players too.
Do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Sarah said, and David, but that was less recently. One thing that I would maybe add to what Sarah was saying is I think I'm worried about sort of like snowballing effects of data in the sense that, those who have the data now will just collect more data because people will use their systems, right? And this was what I think you can arguably say led to sort of like an oligopoly of Google in the search market, because it's not really page rank that makes Google work, it's web clicks. Every time you use ChatGPT, OpenAI is storing your data. And they would be fools not to use it. I will say that apparently their terms of service does say that if it's used as an API, they are not storing it. But terms of service change over time. It's anyway, that's a whole separate question. But I think this question of not just who has the existing data, but how does the existing data beget more data, just reinforces the sort of monopoly.
David, I'd love to hear from you here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really want to echo and highlight a point that Sarah made, which is, I think, absolutely crucial, which is the role of infrastructure in all of this. And in particular, the role of all of these generative AI algorithms and the extent to which they depend crucially on cloud infrastructure provided by a small number of private companies. And I think that that's something that's not often talked about, because when we discuss AI, we frequently focus on the algorithm. And the algorithm is where we see the innovation around AI. But I think the discussion of and focus on the algorithm actually obfuscates the infrastructure that makes the algorithm work. The algorithm would simply not work without the infrastructure that's required to support it. And again, that infrastructure is owned by a small number of private companies. It's a private infrastructure that has large-scale public use. Lest we think that this is anything new, there are historical examples of this in the history of the United States. For example, when the railroads were owned by several private companies, leading to the days of the Carnegies, for example. I think that one of the things that we need to emphasize more strongly in the public discourse is the interplay between the infrastructure and the algorithm, because otherwise we aren't really looking at the full picture, and we then run the risk of leaving the harms of generative AI as an externality, something that is outside of the scope or what we call the system boundary of the algorithm. And yes, it's certainly outside the system boundary of the algorithm, but it is not outside of the infrastructure plus algorithm system. Okay, and so what that means is that if we start thinking about this as an infrastructural problem, then we can start thinking about what that means as far as, for example, the energy costs, the water costs, the other externalities, such as harms to impacted communities, that we have a very solid basis for talking about in the case of other infrastructure systems.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move to the audience questions, and Starting with this question, what danger do you see from an individual creating intentionally malicious AI systems? David, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is something that we've seen now for several years, not just from generative AI, but in general from large-scale content delivery systems. There's been a lot of focus on misinformation and disinformation through social media platforms, in part because those platforms allow content generators to scale that mis and disinformation. And you probably all remember back in 2016, we were talking about bots, because bots essentially allow for scaling. We're now at the next iteration, or perhaps a few iterations from then, where we can talk about mis and disinformation generated at scale in a way that is more coherent and therefore maybe more convincing. And so again, the technology plus the infrastructure here allows us to scale up the potential for individuals to cause harm at scale, and at the same time, those costs are being borne by the people, yes, who are being impacted by that mis and disinformation, but also by the costs of technology. I mean, Sarah said it very, very clearly when she said that the costs of the compute costs for OpenAI were eye-watering. They are actually paying a very, very real cost every time somebody generates information at scale. And so one of the questions that we may have to ask is, are they willing to pay the cost, given that this is the output? And is there some way in which we can understand the circumstances under which, when somebody is engaged in malicious behavior, we actually know what the actual cost is in dollars to firms like OpenAI, because that may allow us to get some sense of accountability. That may allow us to get some sense of the ways in which, if they were to engage in actions to try to reduce those sorts of harmful behaviors, it would actually save them money.
Okay, thank you so much. Could someone define intelligence? That this person asks, it's just to this person, it's just not described clearly in artificial intelligence. Hal, do you want to take that?
It looks like Sarah wants to take it, so please do.
Oh, okay.
I'm happy to jump in quickly. I mean, I think what's important here, and the reason for your sort of vagueness around it, is that AI has meant lots of different things over the course of its history. It's been almost 80 years. And what people have meant by artificial intelligence has really changed over time, like the kinds of systems that they're trying to build, the way that they conceive of intelligence. So, and I would also note that like intelligence is often defined in terms that are highly racialized and gendered historically too. And that's a really key dimension of the field that's shaped the field of artificial intelligence. So I think what's useful today in today's discussion is to think of AI, I think similarly to how Hal introduced it originally, as like essentially a set of data-centric technologies that require massive amounts of data, are looking for patterns in that data. They require massive amounts of computational power to process that data. And then they're used like sort of to then be deployed in a product form. This is true of generative AI, which is used, looking for patterns in order to generate text or images or video. This is also true of automated decision-making systems, which could be as simple as like basic statistics to identify, patterns and then sort of churn out a decision or a ranking. Also important to note that some things that are branded as artificial intelligence don't even qualify under that definition. It might just be like an interface, and there's actually people on the back end doing that processing. So, that's why I think I keep quoting the FTC, but they've been talking a lot about this recently. They recently described it as largely a marketing term, because describing something as AI sort of obfuscates what's going on underneath the surface. So I think it's useful to bring a critical eye to where the term AI is being used.
Thank you so much. Here's a question for you, Hal. Could you please define the AI tech stack? What are the various components and what layers can have guardrails and safety features built in?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a hard question, but I'm going to take Sarah's definition, which I think is sort of the right modern definition, which is sort of, like these large scale systems built on lots of data, right? So I think, I usually think of things in terms of what I think is often called like the AI life cycle. So, how do AI systems end up as systems? So there's typically some sort of design phase where you figure out what it is that you're trying to do. There's typically some sort of data collection and possibly data annotation phase, where you collect the data that's necessary or that you think is necessary to do the thing that you want to do. Often you can't actually find the data for what you want to do, so you find something that's like correlated with it, which introduces all sorts of other issues. Then there's usually some modeling and algorithmic work, and then some, sort of usually like large scale training, followed by some sort of deployment, often with some sort of feedback loops, right? So you're collecting feedback from the people who are using them. And then also in a broader sense, you're collecting feedback from, the New York Times when it writes that your chatbot has turned into Hitler or something like that. And so, all of these stages like feedback onto each other. I think people used to call this they used a more like linear term rather than life cycle, but I think these are sort of the main pieces. But I think one of the things that David said that is important to recognize is that it's actually very rare, if ever, that a person actually interacts with like an AI algorithm, as I would think of it as a computer scientist. What they're doing is they're interacting with a system, and that system has a component that's driven by some data-driven predictive modeling. And you have extremes like what Sarah was saying, where like actually there is no data-driven predictive modeling. There's a person on the other end. And then you have other extremes where like maybe it's a little closer to the surface, like ChatGPT. I think at least gives the impression that you're interacting more directly with the system. It's not entirely clear how true that is. But then in terms of guardrails, I mean, I think there's ample opportunity for issues to arise at every one of these stages. One of the things that I think Sarah at least alluded to was with, things like ChatGPT, the way that at least as far as we know, the way that a lot of behaviors that are deemed to be undesirable, at least by whoever at OpenAI is making these decisions, are prevented is, you basically have a bunch of people labeling ChatGPT outputs as like okay or not okay, and then trying to generalize this to new outputs. So I think we have some ways of putting guardrails up, but they're all very imperfect. Like there was the Snapchat AI came out recently, and if you ask it to like write a story about a man and a woman getting married, it's happy to do that. If you ask it to generate a story about a man and a man getting married, it says, I won't do that because this is like sensitive. And it's like, okay, I don't know who made that decision. But, so even when you try to put guardrails up, it's very hard to figure out, where those should be.
Thank you so much for that. We have so many questions and so little time, so I'm going to combine two here. And this is for David. Can you talk about how generative AI tools might benefit data analysis? And also, could you talk about some standards for vetting data? Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think the underlying premise of this question is super important, which is all about access to data that is used to train these models. And so I'll take one about standards for vetting data first. And one of the things that I'll point out is that a lot of the large language models that are out there are trained on data sets that are not really available to the public, or at least if they are available to the public, we don't know exactly what parts of the data sets things were trained on. And so one of the key concerns around evaluating generative AI models is simply that it's really, really hard to know exactly what happened in order to generate that model. And that means it's hard to know what the underlying possible biases may be. It's hard to know whether the model is simply repeating something that was in the training data set or is actually generating something new. It's really, really hard to know in general what happened. And so to the point of the question, we cannot even start to think about developing standards for some of these models until we have the ability, for example, as researchers, to be able to access the data that trains these models and to be able to access the process by which the models themselves were generated. Once we can actually have some sort of external insight into how this happened, then we can get some sense of like, okay, when you train the model this way, this is the potential outcome that you might have. When you train the model that way, you get this other outcome. And then once we have that, we start to build a big enough knowledge base that we can start to say, all right, these are standards that make sense in this particular context. Without that underlying knowledge base and that scientific process, there is simply no way to generate standards because the standards aren't based on any knowledge. So we need to have knowledge before we can get to standards. And that, of course, requires access to the underlying training technique and data. So I'm sorry, remind me, please, the other question.
So the stages of the data in the value chain, data wrangling, data cleaning, data analysis, how might it help those stages?
Absolutely. So I think just following on the prior point, all of those stages are phases in which crucial decisions are made in the ways that model output could be shaped. And one of the things that I really sort of want to highlight is that throughout that life cycle, throughout that value chain where you're doing data wrangling, which is to say data collection, and then data cleaning, which is to say deciding which data is important to include and which data is not important to include, and perhaps fixing things that you think are not entered correctly, or removing content or adding content. And then finally, model training. There are human beings at each of those stages making decisions about what is important and what is not important. And at each of those stages, those human beings are exercising decisions and judgments based on their own values, and those values then get baked into the model. And so in many cases, one of the things that we as consumers frequently don't recognize explicitly is that the output of these models reflect the values of the people throughout that value chain. And what that means in practice is that those values may or may not align with the values of the end user. And since it's an AI algorithm that's based on a mathematical formulation, we like to think about it as if it were objective. But in fact, that output is in many ways very much reflective of a very small number of people's values that may not even necessarily realize that they're encoding those values into that entire process. And so what ends up happening at the end of it is that we get results that are reflective of decisions that are made by people. We may not agree with those decisions, and they may not even realize the consequences of the decision that they're making, or even that the decision itself is in some way potentially problematic. So what we get out of this is the possibility for bias, the possibility for harms, and the possibility for benefits too, of course. But we don't necessarily recognize how much of that is dependent on human decisions versus dependent on the data versus dependent on the ways in which the algorithm itself is trained. And again, until we have insight into that entire process, there's absolutely no way for us to build standards and build best practices because we don't know what's going on behind the curtain. And so until that curtain is raised, there are going to continue to be a lot of questions and frankly, a lot of complexity and unexpected outcomes.
Thank you so much. Sarah, here's one for you. You already talked about the environmental impact, but are there ways to use generative AI in a more ecologically responsible way?
I mean, I think the short answer right now is basically no. Like the systems that most of us have access to are, generative AI at massive scale. Now there is some experimentation with producing small scale generative AI systems. Most of these don't have the same capabilities as the ChatGPT style systems that are sort of focused on commercial deployment. I think what this question raises though, is do we necessarily need to continue with a model for artificial intelligence that is so focused on scale? Because scale is a proxy. It's sort of like a way of getting to a set of standards for accuracy. But it's not the only way to build artificial intelligence. And I'd be curious if Hal or David want to jump in on this, because I'm sure that they know much more than I do on this. But there are other things that we could be optimizing for in artificial intelligence. But I think that the focus and then the main thrust of research has really been on like continuously like larger and larger scale model development. And if I were like a Ph.D. doing my like research work in artificial intelligence, I think it'd be hard to also get like published or get into the most prestigious conferences if you're not doing that kind of AI research today.
Thank you so much.
That doesn't mean it always has to be that way, I think is the key point.
Does anyone else want to comment?
I can just add a really quick point to that, which is that the real world is complex. And the way that we often deal with that complexity is by building models that can accommodate more complex relationships. And so if we want to make predictions that can handle that complexity, our approach has been in the past couple of decades to build bigger and bigger models. But I want to point out that this is actually an approach that is at odds with the scientific process before that had sort of as its as its mantra, keep things as simple as possible and no simpler. And so one of the things that we're trying to do right now is we're trying to privilege predictive accuracy at the expense of explanation. And so explanation fundamentally is about boiling things down to as simple a description as you can get that gives you some acceptable amount of prediction. And so what we are moving away from is explanation. We're moving towards prediction, which is getting more and more and more prediction. But we don't necessarily care if we can explain it or not. And now we're starting to see the consequences of that. We don't know if our data sets are biased. We don't know if our results are trustworthy because we don't have an explanation. And so there's really a tension here between the culture that's been driving the scaling on one hand versus the scientific process as it's been conceived over the past several centuries. And that's something that I think we as a society really have to come to terms with.
Thank you so much for that. It's a fabulous foray into the next entree into the next question, which is for Hal. Could you please just briefly describe various types of AI, because it's very confusing to people. And so is there a hierarchy of AI based on the amount of data used? Is there a hierarchy of AI based on trying to get to a prediction versus an explanation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I feel like this is super hard to answer. I mean, as a computer scientist, I think of hierarchy traditionally as like output complexity. So like how complicated is the thing that you're trying to predict, sort of in and of itself, like you're trying to predict a single yes, no, or make a picture. And then also complexity in terms of like how separated is the input from the target output, right? So, history of movie watching to what movie am I going to watch next is maybe not that complicated of a prediction versus, draw me a picture of a giraffe on the moon in the style of, I don't know, some artist that my brain is not pulling up right now to an image, right? That's sort of further. But Yeah, I don't know that I can give sort of a hierarchy. I think there's just a lot of axes along which systems vary. One of the things, there was this nice paper by Qian Yang and some other people a couple of years ago about what makes AI systems hard to design for. And they identify two of these axes, one of which is unpredictability, and the other of which is complexity. I think there are more, but that's one sort of initial two-dimensional way you can maybe start to think about categorizing systems.
Thank you so much for that. Sarah, here's one for you. Do you see anybody who's handling generative AI, any company that's handling generative AI responsibly? And what are your criteria for that?
I was smiling because that's a really difficult question. I mean, like, what we've seen, well, one, we've seen this massive race to push out generative AI products over the span of a few months. And so I think it would be very hard to say that there's been any kind of meaningful evaluation of these systems, just given the rapid push to product and given the risks that I think are quite inherent to these models writ large. I think, lots of companies are, now instituting guardrails. I think the fact that they're open APIs and they can see what people are experimenting with lets them refine those guardrails. But frankly speaking, I think, across the entire category of generative AI, there are some real concerns that need to be addressed, and what these tools, writ large enable, and the systemic harms. So I think it's the push to deploy these as widely available commercial products that is itself the thing that's irresponsible, rather than what the guardrails that any particular company is deploying.
Thank you. So that this is an extraordinarily hard question to answer. Can I ask, can all three of you stay for like 3 more minutes so we can get through as many of these as possible? Is that okay?
I can stay for a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Hal?
Yep.
Okay. David?
Yes.
Okay. Here's one for you, David. It's basically saying, you're probably aware that the UK is now creating its, well, I'm not sure they're creating it. I saw that there was a demand for a public large learning model. And so thinking about data and the algorithms and the technology as infrastructure, if the US were to do something like that, how would we resolve the normative questions about training and reinforcement training?
That is a wonderful question, and it's hard to answer because it's a pretty hypothetical situation in the U.S. context. I can certainly speak to my personal preferences regarding how we might want to do something like this. But I think one of the key things to realize is that in the U.S. context, we would obviously have to go through the U.S. governance process. And the big question is going to be who would be the one generating that model? And would there be a role for government oversight in that? Would there be a role for government funding? Or would it be primarily in the private sector? And so if it's in the private sector, of course, in the US context, then the ones that are generating the data and the ones that are providing the data would have a lot of say into how that model gets generated. And we can question whether that is the ideal approach. On the other hand, if there is a response from the government, then I think there would be some degree of political discussion regarding what some of those details might be. One of the key things that I do want to point to that I think is a very positive development is the development of NIST's AI risk management framework, which rather than providing a public large language model for study, because again, that one particular large language model may not necessarily be representative of what's being generated by the Googles and the Microsoft and the OpenAI, right? Rather, the risk management framework provides a taxonomy and an approach by which we can actually engage in the measurement and the mapping and broadly speaking, the governance of the risks associated with AI systems. And so I think that one of the key things that we should think about in the US context is how we take this risk management framework, which is a voluntary framework, and we map that framework to the development of any AI systems, whether they're public or they're private. And I think that means that we have to get involved key stakeholders that are experts in those various different functions laid out by the mapping framework. So for example, requirements development, requirements elicitation, ensuring the right people are in the room, and ensuring that the technology actually maps to what those requirements say. Those are all key functions that have traditionally not been explicitly part of the computer science AI development lifecycle, but are nevertheless very consistent with this risk management framework. And I think that if we were to develop any public large language model, or frankly, any public algorithm or any public infrastructure, this risk management framework gives us the language to talk about how we might do so in a manner that is consistent with American values and consistent with the American system of governance. And so that's the first direction that I would suggest we go.
Thank you so much for that. We're moving into questions about governance. So let's start with this one, which I think is for Sarah. Well, I think Sarah could give a great answer to this. So have you seen the UK approach to AI regulation? Very different from the EU approach. It's called a pro-innovation approach to AI regulation. What are the pros and cons of this approach that is supposedly agile and flexible?
I'd first like to jump in with like one point on the last question, on the potential creation of sort of like a public utilities model. The concern that I'd raise about that approach is that the big tech firms continue to have points at which they would maintain significant dominance across their platform ecosystems. So I'm not sure that a utilities model necessarily is going to be the correction that I think is intended for the like massive consolidation within tech firms. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind. Another alternative way of thinking about it that I've heard proposed is to think about some sort of separations regime that would, separate out like cloud computing capabilities from the production of like deployed product or something similar to that. I think that there's a lot of thinking that's needed here, but maintaining that like picture of what's happening in the larger market. And like the fact that that's where most like we're kind of not really ultimately going to be most of the end users of these systems, especially if they're so expensive. Like it's other businesses. It's businesses that are going to be deploying it in their commercial ventures. And so maintaining that picture of what's happening in a highly consolidated market, I think remains important. Now,
Sarah, if I may just interrupt you, when
Yeah.
you say larger market, you mean so the whole supply chain. So this, one company should not own the semiconductors, the cloud capacity. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing sort of across the entire supply chain ownership by the same companies, and then like this marketplace model, but where the scale is very much tipped in their favor, I think is the concern. So we might be able to have more, widespread academic research, which is important, and I'm not denying the underlying importance of, broadening access to be able to do that kind of work outside of the confines of big tech. But I think, within the market context, there are many factors that are going to continue to tip the scales towards like essentially three companies.
And can you talk a bit about the business models that underpin that and where that might lead to regulation?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much evolving, right? We're kind of seeing companies try and figure out how to eke out a profit from these systems live. it's like Microsoft is siphoning access to its AI hardware. They're all trying to figure out ways to move more efficiently. These systems are really expensive, and while they're sort of open for wide use right now, I think what we've seen in other domains of cloud computing is, contractual arrangements that are really cheap at the start, and then the prices sort of rank up over time. So we should be looking out for that. The business model, I think, is still taking shape, but I'm paying attention to the marketplace approach that a lot of companies are taking, and then they're kind of, Google is somewhat different. It seems in how it's approaching, just integrating it across like the many different products that we all use every day.
Thank you so much for that. Carol, can you talk about a participative and inclusive approach to building trust in AI? Because we had some questions about the role of women and how these systems may be biased.
Yeah, I mean, so, you can look back over headlines for the past 10 years and find any number of issues like this. I think there's sort of two levels at which you can, at least two levels at which you can think of sort of participation. So one is, like David was saying, right, who's making all the decisions as the system gets built? And also earlier, right, like who's even deciding that this system should be built in the first place? So in the accessibility community, for instance, there's this notion of a disability dongle, which is basically like some piece of hardware that a non-disabled person thought would be useful and is absolutely useless to the people who it was intended to be useful to. And that usually happens because they were not involved in the design of the thing. So I think there's, sort of one level at which you can sort of say, okay, the people or the communities who are going to be most impacted by these systems, how do we involve them throughout the process? And even when they're involved throughout the process, things can still go wrong. There's, I think, another level or another take on this, which is to think more about almost individualized AI systems. So, how can we have systems that, the exact user can, train themselves without sharing data outside, that sort of keeps everything, within their world, to sort of build AI systems that are as useful to them as possible. And there's a lot of questions about, how such a thing would interface with, pre-trained large models and stuff like that. But I think the push should be toward, the people who are most impacted by systems should be the ones who are, ideally building them, right, and deciding on how they're governed, and these sort of normative questions around what data goes in. This shouldn't be, a couple hundred people that get a $10 billion investment making these decisions. It should be the people who are actually impacted.
Thank you. Okay, we are going to have to go. So I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to make any final remarks. And I also want to invite everybody to our webinar next week, where Hal is going to be engaged in a dialogue with one of the few members of Congress, Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia, who is studying computer science and thinks it's essential to understand these new forms of data-driven technology. So, okay, so let each of you go. Sarah, want to make any final remarks?
Sure. I think a couple things that I would maybe want to underscore about this conversation. One is that, AI, we now have sort of like a tangible way to engage with AI, but AI for a long time has been used in making decisions that shape the trajectory of people's lives, and we're often not aware when this is taking place. So I think maintaining that view of AI that looks very holistically beyond just generative AI, I think is really key. I think there's very strong discourses that position the the powerful impacts that artificial intelligence is having on our society, I think it's important to not see this as necessarily inevitable, that there is a lot of scope and shape for through regulation, through, as the WGA strike evidence is through employee-led pushback, like there's very much room and scope to reshape the influence that AI will have on our broader society. And now is a really critical time for that. So, resisting any notion that AI is going to have this like inertia that leads us to, a doomsday future, and instead looking at the places where there have been, significant wins in being able to effectively reshape the future of artificial intelligence. I think that's the note that I would want us all to leave on.
Very cool. David?
So I want to echo that point. I think we're at a critical juncture here. And, obviously there's increasing attention to the potential for regulating AI and the ways in which we as a society should really come to terms with the tremendous potential for benefits, but also the potential for harms from these systems. And so if there's one sort of thing that I'd like to leave the audience with, it's this idea that the AI is not just the algorithm, but it's the algorithm plus the infrastructure. It's the ways in which all of these different pieces fit together, and the ways in which, if we're going to come to terms with some of these major societal concerns, we have to do so by looking at AI in the broader context of the system in which it's embedded, and what we call the socio-technical relations, the ways in which social concerns lead to technical design, and the ways in which those technical designs then come back and impact the broader community. So I just would say that socio-technical element and the relationship to infrastructure are key points.
Hal?
Well, the things I wanted to say have been said. So I will try to say something different. I think, one of the things, sort of building on one of Sarah's last points, that we hear a lot is like, we need to prevent, this apocalypse that's going to happen in 50 years. And I think this diverts attention. And I think this is actually a dangerous way to discuss these problems, because there are problems today that are affecting like people today. And playing this game of worrying too much about, the robots that are going to take over the world, rather than worrying about like the very real tangible effects, negative effects that systems can have today, I think is a disservice to making things work well. So I think when we're thinking about both the benefits and the costs of these systems, I would encourage us to think in, 5-year time ranges, and even today time ranges if you're more in industry, rather than, sci-fi what could happen in the future.
Thank you so much, speakers. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much, audience, and our sponsors who I neglected to name. But in any case, please join us next week. We look forward to seeing you with Congressman Don Beyer, and have a great Cinco de Mayo. Thank you all.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah and David.